Freedom! Freedom! Freedom!
Kwame Nkrumah was a visionary, a revolutionary, and a pathbreaker.
He dared to challenge colonial subjects and the colonial powers so that ordinary African people could organize for their independence.
At long last, the battle has ended.
He had a vision, he had a dream about Ghana.
He broke with the past of bourgeois, gradualist, nationalist politicians.
We dedicate ourselves not only in the struggle to emancipate all the territories in Africa. Our independence is meaningless unless it links up the total replacement of the African continent.
Kwame Nkrumah was the greatest Pan-Africanist and socialist revolutionary organizer that the African world has seen. And if the masses of the people pick up on his ideas, Africa will be free.
Kwame Nkrumah was born 21st September 1909 in a town called Nkrumah in the western region of Ghana.
Kwame Nkrumah grew up in a colony ruled by the British.
There was a governor general and there was a legislative council dominated by colonial commercial interests.
The country existed for the export of raw materials that would serve the industries and economies of European nations.
He was born to parents who were not particularly endowed in terms of their wealth. The father was a goldsmith and the mother was a petty trader.
He is slightly difficult to pin down. He's an Nzima. His dad comes from the Ivory Coast. His mother comes from just the right side of the Ghanaian border. So he's genuinely on the periphery in ethnic terms. He's on the periphery in class terms. He's on the periphery in that he's Catholic.
Experiences of a child growing up in a family such as this one, in the colonial era, where the exploitation, the vast exploitation, was done by capitalists from the metropolis, and where citizens were looked down upon in their own surroundings, must have affected him very greatly.
His mother, Nyaniba, who he was particularly very close to, was very keen for Nkrumah to receive an education.
He also grew up at a time when the Christian churches were trying to make headway there. Almost all the schools that you could attend at that time, and I'm talking of primary schools, there were in the beginning no high schools, were church-run.
Nkrumah was a highly affable young man with both his peers and his tutors. However, he was a very serious student. He was very studious, diligent, had a voracious love of reading. And one of his contemporaries by the name of Beverly Carter said that he always used to remember Nkrumah forever reading, engaging in philosophy and debating with fellow colleagues.
He was hungry for knowledge. He was searching for knowledge. He was desperately in search of knowledge which was necessary at the time if we were to combat the negative effect of colonialism and racism.
Within the Gold Coast and generally West Africa, from the latter quarter of the 19th century, the minority of educated West Africans were pushing and mobilizing, galvanizing for political independence.
I think that Kwame Nkrumah was influenced by a number of very important people as he was growing up in Ghana.
There were people like James Eman Agri.
Nkrumah says of him in his autobiography that he was a most remarkable man, a man who possessed intense vitality and enthusiasm. And it was through Agri, Nkrumah narrates in his autobiography, that his nationalism was aroused.
In a way, Agri mirrored the kind of person Nkrumah wanted to be.
He often said I represent Africa. I've never heard of Agri saying, I represent the Gold Coast. He always said, I represent Africa.
Even though Nkrumah was not taught formally by Agri, he used to visit Agri at church and listen to his Sunday evening sermons. And it was through his sermons that Nkrumah was profoundly inspired in terms of his commitment and convictions towards Pan-Africanism. The last person was Nnamdi Azikiwe, popularly and affectionately referred to as Zeke. He's one of Nigeria's great nationalists and he was a publisher. He had been a graduate of Lincoln and as a result influenced Nkrumah to go and study abroad.
The challenge for Nkrumah to get to the United States of America was basically mainly financial. He didn't have the money.
He stowed away on a boat to get to a relative in Nigeria who was quite wealthy because he thought the relative would help.
That entailed many risks. Of course, when stowaways are discovered on ships, they kill them and throw them overboard. So it was a big risk that he took.
The relative paid for him to go back to the Gold Coast to pick up all his gear and to make final arrangements, paid for him to come to England, and paid for his passage to America.
The social climate and atmosphere in America during the 40s was just like apartheid in South Africa. Complete and total segregation.
He came face to face with the reality of racist oppression. He came face to face with how capitalism exploited even people in the metropolis.
Nkrumah went to an all-African school in Pennsylvania, Lincoln University. As a student in America, Kwame Nkrumah faced many hardships.
There was a point when Kwame Nkrumah didn't have any place to sleep. He used to sleep in the park and used to eat leftovers.
Kwame Nkrumah slept in different people's houses. He washed dishes. He scrubbed floors, to eat, to have a place to live and study. And that's how he moved about. That's how he moved about. His life was very hard.
He's working one job and going to two different schools at the same time. But I think the positive of it was that it put him in contact with the African community in the United States who were oppressed. He had the opportunity to do a survey where he was able to go from house to house and learn from the direct experience of the African people.
Kwame Nkrumah went to school to prepare himself for a great struggle ahead. He knew he was very conscious of why he was there. And this, I think, sets him apart from a lot of students that had been there.
He did enormous amount of reading in his own time. And some of the thinkers that he came across and he remarks in his autobiography are individuals such as Descartes, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Marx, and of course the key influential person he mentions that had a major influence upon him was Marcus Garvey.
Nkrumah was to say that we prefer self-government in danger to servitude in tranquility. And I believe it is these influences of people like Garvey that informed such statements.
Marcus Garvey had the largest Pan-African organization, past or present. And his slogan was simple: Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad.
Kwame Nkrumah made it very clear that the Honorable Marcus Garvey was one of the main persons who actually, raised his consciousness when he read the book Philosophy and Opinion of Marcus Garvey.
That ignited his Pan-Africanism and his commitment to the African continent.
Pan-Africanism, properly defined, is the total liberation and unification of Africa under an all-African socialist government.
Pan-Africanism was a movement which arose out of Africa's unequal and unfair relationship with the rest of the world.
Because at that time, every square inch of Africa, except for Ethiopia, was under direct colonial rule.
Pan-Africanism is an ideology which unites the African people wherever they may be in the struggle for their liberation from exploitation and oppression.
The first 4 Pan-Africanist congresses were held in the US and in Europe, and were not attended by Africans born on the continent. So this is what Kwame Nkrumah experienced, you know, during his time in the US. When he was not in school, he was busy moving about the United States, working with local organizations and national organizations like the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He participated in many debates in Harlem about Pan-Africanism.
Attending Garveyite meetings, attending meetings across the ideological spectrum within American politics as well.
And Nkrumah formed his own organization while he was in the United States, which then published a newspaper called The African Interpreter. And that was talking about the need for African unity.
He came in contact with a man by the name of C.L.R. James, who was a brother born in Trinidad. He was a revolutionary who followed the socialist ideas of Leon Trotsky, who at least defended liberation of Africa, the liberation of all the world with socialism.
In the 1930s, he hasn't got his driving license yet. He's a young man, an experienced man in the United States. He's meeting some of the right people. He's going to the right meetings, he's reading the right books for an active career in anti-colonial politics. And he hits the ground running in the early 1940s when he arrives in Britain.
Nkrumah came to London from 1945 and stayed here till 1947.
Awful London. I mean, a London where the lights went out all the time because of power outages. People were cold. These are Africans living in London where there's no real heating. It's before the days of central heating. One burner gas cookers in the rooms. Rationing, of course, still going on. Being wet and cold the whole time.
And Nkrumah decided to come to England. It is CLR who introduced him to George Padmore. He knew everybody who was politically active anywhere at all, absolutely everybody. And of course this became quite important when Nkrumah got involved with him, because Padmore could introduce him to everybody.
He contributed a lot towards Nkrumah's vision of Pan-Africanism in particular.
And Nkrumah, in his years in the United States and in Britain, was under surveillance. Why would the CIA have had him under surveillance? Well, he was a black man talking about the need for racial equality and against imperialism, which would not have gone unnoticed by the CIA.
Padmore, Du Bois, and others were in the forefront also of the anti-colonial struggle, and they were also in the forefront of the struggle for socialism for newly emergent nations in Africa.
So when Nkrumah comes here, he is under surveillance. I would imagine from the time he spoke at the Manchester Pan-African Conference in 1945, I think everybody who spoke there was under surveillance.
In 1945, there was the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester, England. And the significance of this particular Congress is that you had representatives from the African continent there.
A significant historical gathering of West Indians and Africans who came from all over the colonial world. Over 200 delegates were represented at the Congress, and they demanded an end to colonial rule.
It was co-chaired by Kwame Nkrumah, Dr. W.B. Du Bois, and George Padmore.
Pan-Africanism really only began to talk about colonial freedom at this conference. There were Pan-African conferences before, but mostly they were focused on racial inequalities. They didn't say we want independence now.
Indeed, the final resolution of the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester declared that Africans needed to struggle against colonialism and to establish newly independent states under the banner of socialism.
The people of the Gold Coast were not ruling themselves. They had representatives of the Queen of England ruling through her governor.
I mean, that was direct colonial rule. I mean, there was no significant infrastructure. The only infrastructure that was here was, of course, roads from the mines, to the port.
Nkrumah returned to the Gold Coast in 1947 as a result of an invitation by the United Gold Coast Convention, otherwise known as the UGCC, to take up the appointment as secretary for this new organisation.
He's been noted as a young, clever young man. And he's invited back to be the gopher for the United Gold Coast Convention, which in many senses is the first political party in Ghana.
He was quite suspicious of the leadership of the United Gold Coast Convention because this leadership was made up of representatives of the privileged classes, and Nkrumah doubted their commitment to what he would consider to be independence.
He found them amateurish. He compared with what he had seen in terms of political organisation in London. He found them undirected, that they were part-time politicians. They were more interested in making money than in politics. They had personal reasons for being political.
Well, here again, it's important to recognize that the colonialists had deliberately created an African class who believed in the ideology and believed in the colonial enterprise. This African elite class was interested in ending colonialism, but ending colonialism only to the extent that they assumed the power of the colonialists and continued to maintain the colonial structures.
He builds a party within the party of trusted people who have links with all the other units of disaffection in the Gold Coast, the so-called voluntary associations, and these are all sorts of scholars' unions, market women's associations, and he builds links with them, and that's very brilliantly done.
As Nkrumah was talking about independence now, the opposing forces were saying, no, we don't need that now. We should struggle for independence at some future date.
The youth and the grassroots identified with Nkrumah, whilst the privileged classes were trying to just hold them back and also trying to get Nkrumah to tone down.
He then challenges the involvement of United Gold Coast Convention politicians with the Commission of Inquiry into the riots of February 1948, the Watson Commission, and particularly their involvement in the Kusi Committee that drafts the new constitution. Their involvement in that is a death knell for them. They're involved with the colonial state in making another colonial constitution, and he denounces them, and he's in a perfect position to do that. He does it very, very cleverly.
The pressure from the youth and the grassroots was such that in 1949, Nkrumah broke away from the United Gold Coast Convention and set up the Convention People's Party.
On June 12, 1949, he formally launched the Convention People's Party at West End Arena, Accra here. And the party was formed and was born, and all of us registered as members.
And right away, of course, there was antagonism on the side of the UGCC, aligning themselves with Europe, while Kwame Nkrumah was aligning himself with the masses of the people in Ghana.
The Convention People's Party, or CPP, was created as a vehicle to bring emancipation to the local people of the Gold Coast at that time.
No oppressor abandons oppression as a gift to the oppressed. I've not heard of it anywhere in the world. Colonialism is not a tea party. Colonialism is tough. Colonialism is wicked. And colonialism is oppression. And so when you want to get yourself out of this, it's a struggle. You can't get out of it just by passing resolutions and smiling, making good speeches. You have to fight. And you have to remove the oppressor. And if you don't fight to remove the oppressor will even recruit people internally, and they'll continue acting on behalf of the oppressor throughout.
The campaign for positive action that Nkrumah's Convention People's Party pursued was a strategy very much influenced by Gandhian philosophy and principles. It was a strategy of non-violence and civil disobedience.
While Nkrumah was calling for positive action, the strikes, the demonstrations and stuff, the other people were calling him a troublemaker and a rabble-rouser.
Which then gives the colonial state the excuse for banging up lots of people for inciting an illegal strike. He's banged up. And of course it's absolutely perfect that he's banged up as his first period of martyrdom.
Nkrumah spent 14 months in James Fort prison in Accra.
And he plays this to the limit, and he knows enough about Gandhi and so on to know this is a clever and useful thing to do. Meanwhile, the work of the party, which has already been put in train as a well-oiled machine, is going on outside.
He wrote letters that he wrote on toilet paper that was smuggled out of the prison and carried to his right-hand lieutenant, Kwame Gebedema.
The legislation at that time did not prevent him from contesting as a parliamentary candidate. And it became clear at a point in time when the colonial government agreed that constitutional rule for Ghana was going to begin, that Nkrumah was also going to stand.
And it then comes to the first general election that Ghana has ever had in 1951, which is contested by his political party, the Convention People's Party, although he's still in the nick. He stands for Accra Central and overwhelmingly wins the seat.
England was forced to allow there to be a referendum of independence or staying with colonial rule, and the CPP won landslide victory.
And under that pressure, he's released by the governor. And because the Convention People's Party won more seats than anybody else, they're asked to form the first African government in the Gold Coast, along with colonial officials.
The election was met with enthusiasm and excitement everywhere in the African world. I mean, Ghana had become now the black star of the world. I mean, everybody looked to Ghana.
The British were very clever about it. He should have been prime minister, but they decided, for their own purposes, that he shouldn't be prime minister, but leader of government business.
And the British come out of this thinking he's a really good guy, and this is a really smart party that, compared with all the other guys who'd been political leaders before, this guy delivers the goods. He's a politician. He's not just a politician, he's actually a statesman.
It is my earnest and confident belief that my people in Ghana will go forward in freedom and justice, in unity among themselves.
On the 6th of March 1957, Kwame Nkrumah became Ghana's first Prime Minister of an independent state. The Gold Coast now became Ghana.
Ghana was the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to obtain independence. And so therefore he was an inspiration to an entire continent to arise and seek their own freedom from the shackles of colonialism.
At long last, the battle has ended. Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever.
Kwame Nkrumah became Ghana's first Prime Minister of an independent state. The Gold Coast now became Ghana.
We're very, very proud, because for the first time we had a Ghanaian in charge of Ghana.
From now on, there is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle and show that after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs.
To symbolize that the Gold Coast was now an independent country, Kwame Nkrumah and his Convention People's Government decided to change the name from the Gold Coast to the historically ancient name of Ghana. Ancient Ghana, going back as far back as the 5th century, was an ancient kingdom in West Africa, and therefore Nkrumah and the CPP decided to revert back to this historic name.
Dr. Kwame Nkrumah became known later as Osajefo, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. And Osajefo in the Akan language of Ghana means savior. But he was also known as Showboy and had another series of nicknames to indicate the extent of his charisma, which was electric.
His slogan was, "Thought without action is empty, and action without thought is blind," so that we need men and women who think like men and women of action and act like men and women of thought.
The task then was to begin to build a new nation, united nation, a nation in which its people saw themselves first and foremost as Ghanaians, rather than Ashantis and Ewes and Dagombas and so on. So that was the task. The primary task was to build a new united Ghana with a distinct Ghanaian identity.
The challenges that Nkrumah faces start well before independence. In 1954, the Minister of Finance was Kwame Bedema, stands up and presents a paper to the cabinet saying the cocoa price is going to go down, that basically chocolate makers worldwide are overstocked, the price of chocolate's going to go down, there's no market growth predictable in future, and the conclusions drawn in cabinet then are what we want to do in terms of social change, advancing the need for education for all, health service, building a deep water port at Tema, improving the infrastructure so that the supply of farm produce to towns and so on can be enhanced and so on. We're going to have to do that fast. So they spend like drunken sailors.
Some of the industrialization projects he carried out were the building of roads, there's various schools and hospitals. He poured a great deal of money into education. In
a relatively short period of about 6 years, educational institutions had been built in all the districts of Ghana that introduced fee-free and compulsory education for every Ghanaian child.
For all students, both girls and boys, from primary school to higher education.
They're using up reserves because it's not going to last. They know that there are bad times coming. So that is the fundamental challenge, that if you want to reconstruct a state, if you want to make a modern state, if you want to industrialize a state, and so on, you need cash. There's no serious outside investment at the time. There's a lot of bent outside investment at the time, which is another story. But the challenge he faces basically is a decline in government revenue. And it's fundamentally a government revenue-based development project that he's on about with the first 2 5-year plans.
The construction of the hydroelectric project in Akosombo was key to the industrialization of Ghana.
With declining state revenues, with an increasingly hostile Western world, but I think also an indifferent Eastern world, Russians always talk about supporting him, but in terms of what actually turns up on the doorstep in terms of cash or things, not very much to show for it.
He has gone to the US to raise funds for the construction of the Akosombo Dam. The US didn't want to support, and they were dragging their feet. So he reluctantly had to make a move to the Soviet Union to support. And that was when America decided that it's, Kaiser.
You have to remember, in the world, there was sort of East versus the West. We're involved in what they call the Cold War, communism versus capitalism. Africa was caught in the middle. All the countries that had become liberated and were fighting for their freedom were vying for that country to be in either the Western camp or the Eastern camp. Kwame Nkrumah and the parliament decided that they must be non-aligned. They were not supporting the West against the East, nor the East against the West, but they were moving forward toward Pan-Africanism.
Nkrumah's vision for Ghana was very much a microcosm of his vision for the entire African continent.
On the eve of Ghana's independence, Nkrumah made a statement that the independence of Ghana was meaningless unless it was linked up with the total liberation of the African continent.
We dedicate ourselves not only in the struggle to emancipate all the territories in Africa. Our independence is meaningless unless it links up with the total liberation of the African continent.
And so it was, Vice President, that from the very first day of her independence, Ghana served as a rear base for the total liberation of our continent.
Nkrumah gave practical expression to this declaration by first of all organizing the All-African People's Conference of 1958, at which all the liberation movements in Africa participated and formulated strategies for overthrowing colonialism.
Nkrumah gave enormous logistical and practical support to various liberation movements such as Patrice Lumumba of the Congo, Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau, and Kenneth Kaunda of present-day Zambia, and many others.
He invited George Patmore to serve as his advisor for African affairs. And he also invited the man who had been the president of the 5 Pan-African Congress, the first Pan-Africanist Congress, all the way through the 5th Pan-Africanist Congress, W.E.B. Du Bois. He invited him to serve as his minister for Encyclopedia Africana.
Ghana had become the Socialist Republic of Ghana because health care, education was free.
There's an African saying which, simply put, means he who has his mouth in the kitchen of his enemy can never be liberated. And Nkrumah sought to take our mouth from the kitchen of the metropolis.
Kwame Nkrumah believed in developing a new way forward where African economies could be transformed to cater for the needs of their own people without being dependent totally on external forces.
One of the things that Nkrumah did was to establish a huge cattle ranch to provide the meat that our people needed. He also established a tannery to produce the leather, and then established a shoe factory to turn the leather that has been produced by the tannery into shoes and other leather products for our people.
1964, I was 21 years old. I came to Ghana and what I witnessed was just phenomenal. I didn't want to leave. I see new schools being built every day, free education. I see new hospitals being built, new clinics, free health care. I see factories being built by Africans, not by Chinese, not by South Koreans, but by Africans.
In Ghana, you go there and you see African pilots. You see African news presenters. You hear African music, African clothes. And down in Ghana, we got our own national bank.
Nkrumah also established the Black Star Line, which was a shipping line to promote trade between the African countries and Africans in the diaspora and so on.
The significance of the flag of Ghana, and that is the symbolism held in the star.
Just as Kwame Nkrumah said that the African can determine his own future if he's left alone. And the star, it really represents that star that Marcus Garvey, the Honorable Marcus Garvey, had for the Black Star Liner.
This would have moved Africa toward economic independence. That antagonized the West.
And particularly Nkrumah's ambitions to unite the African continent within the context of a union government for Africa also made Nkrumah and his ideas a danger to imperialist interests.
Cocoa at that time, alongside gold, was one of the key primary products that Ghana was exporting in order to derive foreign exchanging capital to manage its economy.
Prices began to decline considerably, and therefore this correlated with the declining living standards of most Ghanaians.
From a high of 400 pounds per ton of cocoa in sometime 1965, it had fallen to about 80 pounds.
We also have to remember that this decline in the cocoa prices was manipulated by various Western powers who wished to impose an economic squeeze on Kwame Nkrumah's government. And as a result, many Ghanaians became economically and also politically disenchanted with Nkrumah's government.
He pegs wages at a time when inflation is raging. Not only does he do that, he demands that workers contribute to a compulsory savings scheme. And that meant that you took some of your wages, but the rest of your wages were produced as a bond, which you could cash in, I can't remember, 3 years or 4 years' time. And of course, these bits of paper were never produced.
In addition to that, there was also a rise in corruption amongst officials, state officials and CPP officials that led many Ghanaians to question the CPP.
The National Liberation Movement had taken the part of terrorism against Nkrumah. Supporters of Nkrumah were being killed on a regular basis. They were exploding bombs across the country and so on, and generally creating a situation of insecurity.
He had a vision for the future. He was not really working for that year. He does not work for the public consumption. He was just doing it for the right reason. And that is why a lot of people fell apart and started to be confused and, doubting his intentions. They thought he was misguided.
Imperialist forces stepped up their opposition, stepped up their action. There was about 6 or 7 attempts on Nkrumah's life.
In the 60s, there were many assassination attempts on Nkrumah, and one of them actually took place in the Flagstaff House, where he had his office and also his residence.
A police officer was planted to shoot Nkrumah.
This was a police officer on guard duty who attempted to shoot him with his rifle.
He came and just opened the door, and at that time Nkrumah was behind that door. It was a very heavy door. So he knocked him with the door and he fell. And Nkrumah himself disarmed him because he knew some basic techniques. Nkrumah liked jogging, he likes walking, he likes exercising, he likes doing judo, karate, these little things.
And you can see from the picture behind me, Nkrumah putting down an assassin, somebody who tried to assassinate him.
These activities of sabotage, bombing, continued throughout the regime. Some of the actions he had to take to deal with the sabotage included the Preventive Detention Act, where people who were involved in this acts of sabotage and destabilization were imprisoned.
Today, countries like the United States of America, countries like the United Kingdom, have passed legislation which is similar to the Preventive Detention Act. Are we to say today that David Cameron is a dictator? Are we to say that Barack Obama is a dictator? Because they've essentially passed the same laws. Those laws were passed in response to the anarchy and recklessness of the opposition to Nkrumah. I remember the story which was put out by the opposition to Nkrumah, that Nkrumah was keeping people in jail and maltreating them and so on. And they got photographs published in London and other places. Eventually it turned out that those photographs had been taken from a Togolese prison rather than a Ghanaian prison.
Now, I'm only beginning this research. In 2 days in the National Archives in Washington, apart from finding that the consul was helping people form opposition political parties, I also found that in 1964, so 2 years before the coup, the head of the CIA has a meeting with the head of the State Department, their Foreign Office, and says, I really think General nkrumah would be the best person to take over. Now, if he says that in February 1964, it means he has already been dealing with the people plotting the takeovers and deciding whom to help with the takeover.
There's one very, very significant cable which was dispatched from the British High Commission in Accra, and the British High Commissioner in Accra then was A.W. Snelling, who dispatched a cable to the Home Office which simply said that the British establishment had to get rid of Nkrumah because he was making the African too politically conscious. What damning evidence.
The factors that led to the coup that overthrew Kwame Nkrumah's government can be separated into internal factors and external factors. Among them were the declining economic situation in the country, whereby in 1965, Ghana only had £500,000 in sterling in their reserve account. Nkrumah's perceived meddling, interference with the army and the police, particularly after the 1964 assassination attempt on him. He had removed the police chief, and in the subsequent year, 1965, he'd also demoted several of the generals. Another important factor was also the fact that he had set up a new military structure known as the Presidential Own Guard Regiment with its own security apparatus, and this was perceived as a threat by the army. However, the most critical external factor in the coup d'etat was the plotting and conspiracy by the United States of America, Britain and France with their near-colonial agents in the army, the Ghana Army and the Ghana Police Force. They acted in concert to overthrow Kwame Nkrumah.
Now, all of these forces, Western intelligence forces and Western governments, plotted systematically against Nkrumah, recruited local collaborators and so on, in order to get rid of Nkrumah, not because Nkrumah was bad for the Ghanaian and African people, but simply because Nkrumah wanted to stop the exploitation of our resources for the benefit of others.
Nkrumah had a slogan that when you're talking to the imperialists and he's smiling, he comes in, oh, hello, how are you? Then he's making profit on you. But when the imperialist comes to sit with a straight face, it means the business is straightforward.
In 1965, Osachafo Kwame Nkrumah wrote a book called Neo-Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism. In this book, Kwame Nkrumah lays out the grand master plan for Europe and America's recolonization of Africa, and did it elaborately. The Western world read that book and said, this man has to go.
24th of February 1966 coup took place when Nkrumah was out of the country. He was invited by President Ho Chi Minh, the leader of North Vietnam, to participate in peace initiatives to end the Vietnam War between Vietnam and America.
Troops were moved from Kumasi and Accra. They attacked Flagstaff House, fought the president's own regimental guard. After that, they took over broadcasting. They made an announcement to the country that the myth surrounding Nkrumah has been broken.
That was one of the worst moments in the history of the entire African continent, the celebration of traitors. I spent that whole morning moving around Accra with friends of mine, and we saw the carnage which was being unleashed on the city by these soldiers. I saw Nkrumah's security men arrested and beaten up. I saw them with bayonets in their chests and so on.
He asked me whether I understood the meaning of a coup, and I told him that, well, when the military takes over from a civilian government, they said, he cracked the joke that is the dictionary meaning, but they said this is the beginning of a history in Africa. There will be several coups in Africa, and Africa will sink, and then a new Africa will develop out of the mess.
Nkrumah went into exile in Guinea, but managed to keep touch with the people of Ghana through frequent broadcasts.
I came to Guinea early '68, and this is when we proposed to Kwame Nkrumah to allow us to bring him back to Ghana, because we were ready to bring him back with guns blazing. I mean, we were young and we were ready and excited, pumped up. Kwame Nkrumah looked at us, and smiled. He took the guns out of our hands and put books in our hands. It was quite frustrating for me at the time. I didn't really understand. But thank God he did. In his infinite wisdom, he knew we didn't know what we were doing. He knew that we needed to study.
As co-president of Guinea, he helped shape economic and political policies and so on. But in addition to that, Nkrumah wrote a lot in Guinea.
Nkrumah called the time in Guinea one of the most productive periods of his life. He wrote a number of books during that period.
He maintained contact with progressive embassies such as China, Cuba, and other countries.
He continued to have relations with various Pan-Africanists all over the world, and who went to meet him in Conakry.
In the last 3 years of Nkrumah's life, he experienced deteriorating health. Initially, the cause of his illness was unknown, and he sadly, tragically died of prostate cancer in April 1972.
We pay homage today to the African of the millennium on his 102nd birthday. 21st of September has always been a day of inspiration, and this remains true today.
Let us use the memory of this great leader, President Kwame Nkrumah Osajifo, to spur our continent on to the next phase of the vision of the founders of our nations.
But I believe his greatest legacy is the legacy that hasn't been realized yet, which is his vision of Africa. Because from the onset, he said that Ghana's independence, being the first African country to be independent, he didn't see it as the destination. He just said that, Ghana's independence will be meaningless unless that victory leads to the total liberation of Africa. So Ghana's independence was on the path to that vision. So I believe that the realization of that vision is going to be his most important legacy. And I believe that it's going to be a generation right now who are going to rise up and realize that.
Long live Osajifo, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah never died.